Beggar helps millionaire in the rain. 2 days later, a helicopter lands near her. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. The Chicago winter had never felt colder than on that grey December morning. Lily pulled her threadbare jacket tighter around her small frame, her frozen fingers clutching a bunch of slightly wilted flowers she'd managed to salvage from behind the local florist. At 7 years old, she had already mastered the art of survival on the streets, though her eyes still held a spark of innocence that even the harshest circumstances couldn't extinguish. She positioned herself near the entrance of Millennium Park, where business people hurried past in their warm coats and scarves, barely sparing her a glance. The morning rush was her best chance to sell something, anything, to help her get through another day. But today was different. A storm was brewing and she could feel it in her bones. "Flowers for your heart," she called out softly, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "Words to warm your soul." In her other hand, she held small handwritten cards, each containing messages her mother had taught her before she disappeared. The memory of her mother's voice, warm and gentle, still echoed in her mind. Words have power, Lily. They can heal what medicine can't. The dark clouds loomed overhead, threatening to unleash their fury at any moment. Most people were rushing to get indoors, leaving Lily alone with her flowers and her hope. That's when she saw him, a tall man in an expensive suit, standing beside a sleek black Tesla, frustration etched across his face as he spoke into his phone. "No, I don't care what it takes. Get it done," he barked into the device. Ethan Walker, though Lily didn't know his name yet, ran his fingers through his graying hair, his other hand frantically pressing the key fob with no response. The car remained stubbornly dead. Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, and Lily watched as the man's expensive suit began to darken with moisture. She should have run for shelter, should have protected her precious flowers and cards from the rain, but something made her stay. Perhaps it was the look in his eyes, not just frustration, but something deeper, something that reminded her of what she saw in the mirror sometimes when she thought about her mom. Instead of running, she walked toward him, pulling out one of her special cards. The man didn't notice her at first, too busy cursing under his breath at his dead phone. When she tugged gently at his sleeve, he looked down, irritation flickering across his features before freezing at the sight of her. She held out a slightly crumpled daisy and a card. "The storm only brings light to those ready to see it," she said, reciting the words her mother had taught her. The man's face went pale as if he'd seen a ghost. His hands trembled as he took the flower and card, staring at the handwritten words as if they held some terrible secret. Where did you get this?" His voice cracked as he spoke, all traces of his previous anger gone. But before Lily could answer, a sleek black car pulled up beside them. A woman stepped out, her high heels clicking on the wet pavement. "Ethan, thank goodness I found you. Your assistant called when she couldn't reach you." The woman's eyes fell on Lily, and her perfectly made-up face twisted into a slight frown. "Who's this?" Lily began to back away, clutching her remaining flowers to her chest. Something in the woman's eyes made her want to run, but the man, Ethan, called out, "Wait!" He took a step toward her, but Lily was already disappearing into the rain, leaving him standing there with the daisy and card in his hand. She ran until she reached her hidden spot, an abandoned lot where construction equipment sat idle. A sign proclaimed, "Future Home of Walker Plaza, a premier shopping experience." Lily slipped through a gap in the fence, making her way to the small shelter she'd created from discarded materials. Inside, she pulled out her most precious possession, a book titled Invisible Memories. Her mother had given it to her the day before she disappeared, but Lily had never opened it. "When the time is right, you'll know," her mother had said. Those were the last words Sarah had spoken to her. As the rain pounded on her makeshift roof, Lily huddled in her corner, not knowing that the man with the broken car was still standing in the storm, staring at her card as if it held the key to a door he'd locked long ago. In his mind, another voice echoed those same words about storms and light. His wife Emily's voice, silenced 8 years ago on another rainy night when he'd been too busy with his phone to see the truck coming. Neither of them knew it yet, but that stormy morning had set something in motion that would change both their lives forever. For now, Lily simply tried to stay warm and dry. While across town, Ethan Walker sat in his office, unable to focus on anything except a crumpled daisy and a card bearing words he thought he'd never hear again. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside his vast office, Ethan couldn't shake the image of the little girl's eyes. They reminded him of someone, but he couldn't place who. He slipped the card into his desk drawer, trying to forget, but knowing he wouldn't. Not this time. Meanwhile, in her makeshift shelter, Lily traced her fingers over the cover of Invisible Memories, wondering if today was the day she should finally open it. But something held her back. The same feeling that had made her give that particular card to the man with the sad eyes. Her mother had always said timing was everything, and somehow Lily knew that this wasn't the right moment. Not yet. The following days brought no relief from the winter chill, but for Ethan Walker, the cold seemed to have seeped into his very bones. He sat in his corner office at Walker Construction, staring at the card the little girl had given him, reading those words over and over until they blurred before his eyes. The storm only brings light to those ready to see it. Emily's words. How could this child know them? Margaret, his fiancée, stood in the doorway, watching him with growing concern. She'd tried to dismiss the incident in the rain as nothing more than a coincidence, but she could see it eating away at him. Ethan, you need to let this go. It's just a random phrase some homeless girl picked up somewhere. But Ethan couldn't let it go. The girl's eyes haunted him. There was something familiar about them, something that tugged at his memory like a loose thread he couldn't quite grasp. He pulled up his company's employee database, scrolling through years of records without knowing exactly what he was looking for. I'm going to cancel the Walker Plaza project, he announced suddenly, causing Margaret to nearly drop her coffee. What? That's a $50 million development. The board will never approve. I don't care about the board, Ethan cut her off, his voice firm. Something doesn't feel right about that site. I need to know more about its history. He didn't tell her about how he'd driven past the lot late last night, seeing a small figure disappearing through the fence. He didn't mention how his heart had clenched at the thought of that little girl sleeping rough in this weather. Across town, Lily was having her own struggles. The previous day's rain had soaked through her shelter, ruining most of her remaining flowers. She sat cross-legged on a piece of cardboard, carefully sorting through her cards, protecting the precious words her mother had taught her. Each one was special. Each one had a purpose, though she didn't always know what that purpose was until the right moment came. A shadow fell across her work, and she looked up to see Mrs. Chen from the nearby Chinese restaurant. The old woman held out a container of steaming soup. Too skinny, she clucked her tongue, setting the container down. Your mother, she always said you were too skinny too. Lily's head snapped up. You knew my mom? But Mrs. Chen was already walking away, shaking her head and muttering to herself in Mandarin. Lily wanted to run after her, to demand answers, but years on the street had taught her to be cautious. Instead, she picked up the soup, savoring its warmth and the first real clue about her mother she'd had in 2 years. Back in his office, Ethan had finally found something. An employee file from 3 years ago. Sarah Matthews, a project coordinator who'd worked on several developments before abruptly resigning. There was something about her photo that made his chest tighten. Those eyes, they were the same as the little girl's. Margaret, he called out, his voice strange. What do you remember about Sarah Matthews? Margaret's reaction was subtle but immediate, a slight stiffening of her shoulders, a tightening around her mouth. That name sounds familiar, but I can't quite place it, she said, her voice too carefully neutral. Ethan turned the computer screen toward her. She worked here for 5 years, left suddenly 3 years ago. No exit interview, no forwarding address. He watched Margaret's face carefully. She had a daughter. Oh, her! Margaret waved a dismissive hand, but Ethan caught the tremor in it. She was always causing problems, trying to interfere with projects, claiming there were irregularities in the safety protocols. Drama queen, if you ask me. But Ethan wasn't asking Margaret. He was remembering something else, a stack of letters that had appeared on his desk 3 years ago. Letters he'd never read because Margaret had assured him they were just complaints from a disgruntled ex-employee. Letters that had disappeared before he could get to them. "What happened to those letters, Margaret?" he asked quietly, watching as the color drained from her face. "The ones you said weren't important. I was protecting you." Margaret's voice had taken on a defensive edge. "You were still grieving for Emily. You didn't need someone stirring up trouble with baseless accusations." "What accusations?" Before Margaret could answer, Ethan's assistant buzzed through. "Mr. Walker, there's a Mrs. and Chen here to see you. Says it's about the Walker Plaza site." An elderly Asian woman walked in, her back straight despite her years. She looked at Margaret with open distaste before turning to Ethan. "You are building shopping mall where people live, where Sarah's little girl lives." Ethan felt the room tilt slightly. "Sarah Matthews. You know her?" Mrs. Chen's eyes narrowed. "Knew her. Good woman. Tried to tell truth. Nobody listened." She pulled something from her bag, a battered envelope. "She left this. Said give to you if anything happened to her. 2 years now. Maybe time you finally listen." Margaret stepped forward. "I'll take that." But Mrs. Chen pulled the envelope back, fixing her with a steely glare. "Not for you, for him." She placed the envelope on Ethan's desk. "Sarah say you good man, just lost way. Say you find light again someday." After Mrs. Chen left, Ethan sat staring at the envelope, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for it. Margaret's voice was sharp with panic. "Ethan, don't! Whatever's in there, it's in the past. We've built something good here. Don't let some old accusations ruin everything." But Ethan was already opening the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, Sarah Matthews standing beside a familiar construction site, pointing at something in the structural plans. Next to her was Emily, Ethan's late wife, both women smiling at the camera. The date stamp showed it was taken just days before Emily's death. They knew each other? Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. Emily and Sarah worked together? Margaret's silence was answer enough. Ethan looked up at her, seeing her clearly for the first time in years. "What else have you been hiding from me?" But before Margaret could respond, Ethan's phone buzzed with an urgent message. Someone had reported a child living in the Walker Plaza construction site. City services were on their way to investigate. Ethan grabbed his coat, his heart racing. "Where are you going?" Margaret called after him. "To do what I should have done years ago," he replied, not looking back. "Listen." As he rushed toward his car, the envelope from Mrs. Chen still clutched in his hand. He didn't see Margaret pick up her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed a number. "We have a problem," she said quietly. "He knows." Meanwhile, Lily sat in her shelter, finally holding invisible memories in her hands. Something about today felt different. Maybe it was Mrs. Chen's appearance. Maybe it was the way the winter light fell through the cracks in her shelter. But something told her it was time. Just as she cracked open the cover, she heard vehicles approaching, voices calling out. Her heart began to race as she recognized the sound of official vehicles, the voices of authority that had haunted her nightmares since her mother disappeared. She clutched the book to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she faced an impossible choice. Stay and be found, or run and leave behind everything she had left of her mother. In the distance, she could hear footsteps approaching her hiding place, growing closer with each passing second. Lily's heart pounded against her ribs as she heard the footsteps growing closer. She clutched invisible memories tightly to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she looked frantically around her small shelter. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The voices were getting closer, professional and detached, discussing protocols and procedures that would tear her world apart. Through a crack in her makeshift wall, she could see them, social workers in warm coats, clipboards in hand, discussing her fate as if she were just another case number. But behind them, running through the construction site, she saw him, the man from the storm, his expensive coat flapping in the winter wind as he rushed toward her hiding place. Ethan's lungs burned in the cold air as he ran. The photograph in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Emily and Sarah smiling together, holding secrets he was only beginning to understand. He could see the social workers ahead, approaching the small shelter he'd spotted last night. "Wait!" he called out, his voice hoarse. "Please, wait!" Inside her shelter, Lily heard his voice and felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Without fully understanding why, she called out, "I'm here!" The social workers paused, turning to see Ethan Walker, one of Chicago's most prominent businessmen, running toward them, out of breath and disheveled. "Mr. Walker?" one of them asked, clearly confused by his presence. "We received a report about a miner living on this construction site. We're here to—" "I know her," Ethan interrupted, still catching his breath. She's connected to a former employee of mine. Please let me talk to her first." Something in his voice, his desperate sincerity, made them hesitate and then step back. Lily peered out from her shelter, her small face streaked with tears, the book still clutched protectively to her chest. Ethan approached slowly, kneeling down in the cold dirt to meet her eyes. "Hey there," he said softly. I think you and I need to talk about your mom." The mention of her mother made Lily's lower lip tremble, but she stood her ground. "You knew my mom?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just starting to realize that I should have known her better," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She tried to tell me something important once, didn't she? Something I didn't listen to." Before Lily could respond, a sleek black car pulled up to the construction site. Margaret stepped out, her high heels sinking slightly into the muddy ground. "Ethan, what are you doing? These people are here to help. Let them do their job." But Ethan didn't turn around. He kept his eyes locked with Lily's, seeing in them the same determination he'd seen in Sarah's photograph. "The card you gave me," he said quietly. "Those words about the storm and light. Where did you learn them?" "My mom taught me," Lily replied, her voice growing stronger. "She said they were special words, from someone who saw the truth even when others wouldn't look." She paused, then added, "She said they were from Emily." Ethan felt as if all the air had been knocked from his lungs. Behind him, he heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath. The social workers exchanged glances, clearly sensing they were in the middle of something more complex than a simple case of a homeless child. "Lily," Ethan said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "would you show me what's in that book you're holding?" For a moment, Lily hesitated. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "When the time is right, you'll know." Looking into Ethan's eyes, seeing the same pain and loss she carried in her own heart, she knew this was the moment her mother had been preparing her for. She opened invisible memories for the first time since her mother had given it to her. Inside, she found not pages of text, but photographs, letters, and documents. The first photograph made her gasp. It showed her mother and Emily, arms around each other, standing in front of Walker Construction. They were wearing matching safety-first hard hats and laughing at the camera. "They were friends," Lily whispered, looking up at Ethan with wide eyes. "Best friends." Margaret's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Ethan, this is ridiculous. You can't seriously be considering—" "They were more than friends," Mrs. Chen's voice interrupted as she approached from behind them, carrying a large manila envelope. "They were partners, working together to expose truth about Detroit project." Ethan's head snapped up. "Detroit?" The Hamilton building collapse? Mrs. Chen nodded solemnly. Sarah and Emily, they find problems, big problems. Try to warn you. She shot a pointed look at Margaret. But someone make sure you never get warning. Margaret's face had gone pale. This is absurd. Ethan, you can't believe. But Ethan was already turning pages in the book with trembling hands. There were copies of structural reports, emails, and photographs, all documenting serious safety concerns about the Hamilton building project. And there, paperclipped to one report, was a handwritten note from Emily dated the day she died. Meeting with Ethan tonight. He needs to see this before it's too late. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Emily calling that night, saying she had something important to show him. But he'd been busy with a crisis at work, talking on his phone, not paying attention to the road. She was bringing me these documents, he whispered, his voice breaking. That's why she was driving to my office that night. Lily watched as the strong, successful man before her seemed to crumple in on himself. She did something then that surprised everyone. She stepped forward and took his hand. My mum said Emily was the bravest person she knew, she said softly. She said Emily never stopped trying to do the right thing, even when it was hard. Tears were flowing freely down Ethan's face now. The social workers shifted uncomfortably while Margaret stood rigid, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, opening her manila envelope. Sarah, leave more evidence. Keep it safe, in case something happened to her. She glanced at Margaret. In case someone make her disappear too. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's composure finally cracked. You can't prove anything, she snapped. And even if you could, the statute of limitations, this isn't about legal liability anymore. Ethan cut her off, his voice hard as steel. This is about the truth. About Emily, about Sarah, about everything you've helped hide. He turned to the social workers. I'm assuming temporary guardianship of Lily while we sort this out. I trust that won't be a problem. The social workers, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing understanding, nodded slowly. One of them stepped forward. We'll need to process some paperwork, but given the circumstances, you can't do this. Margaret's voice had risen to a near shriek. Ethan, think about what you're risking. Think about the company, your reputation. I'm thinking about Emily, Ethan replied quietly. And Sarah. And this little girl who's been surviving on her own while we all looked the other way. He stood up, still holding Lily's hand. I'm done looking the other way. But as they turned to leave, Lily suddenly stopped. Wait, she said, turning back to her shelter. She disappeared inside for a moment and came back with a stack of cards, her mother's messages, carefully preserved all this time. These too, she said. Mum said they'd help people find their way back to the light. As they walked away from the construction site, leaving Margaret standing alone in the growing darkness, none of them saw her pull out her phone once more. None of them heard her whispered conversation or saw the look of desperate determination that crossed her face. Back in her expensive car, Margaret made another call. It's worse than we thought. The girl has evidence, actual documentation. We need to move fast. She listened for a moment, her fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. No, nothing that dramatic, but we need to make sure neither of them can testify. Handle it. Meanwhile, in Ethan's warm car, Lily sat in the back seat, still clutching her book and cards. She watched as the city lights blurred past the window, not quite believing how much had changed in a single day. Beside her, Mrs. Chen sat humming softly. She had insisted on coming with them, claiming Lily needed a familiar face during the transition. Where are we going? Lily asked finally, her small voice carrying in the quiet car. Somewhere safe, Ethan replied, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. And then tomorrow, we're going to start looking for your mom. What none of them realized was that at that very moment, in a small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, Sarah Matthews was also looking at a photograph, the same one of her and Emily in their hard hats. Her hands trembled as she watched a news alert pop up on her laptop. Walker Construction CEO halts major development project. Cites personal reasons. It's time, she whispered to herself, touching Emily's smiling face in the photograph. They're finally ready to see the light. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the windows of Ethan's lakeside home, casting long shadows across Lily's sleeping form on the guest room bed. She was curled tightly around invisible memories, as if afraid someone might take it while she slept. Mrs. Chen had insisted on staying the night, settling herself in an armchair near Lily's bed like a vigilant guardian. Ethan hadn't slept at all. He sat in his home office, surrounded by the contents of Sarah's book spread across his desk. Each document, each photograph, each handwritten note felt like another weight on his chest, making it harder to breathe. The evidence was overwhelming, not just about the Detroit collapse, but about years of covered-up safety violations, all carefully documented by Emily and Sarah. His phone had been ringing non-stop. Board members, lawyers, reporters, all demanding answers about the sudden halt of the Walker Plaza project. He'd ignored them all, focusing instead on the stack of papers before him. One document in particular held his attention, an email from Emily to Sarah dated the day before the accident. S.E. doesn't know yet. Been trying to tell him, but M keeps intercepting everything. Meeting him tonight will show him everything. He's a good man, just lost his way. Remember what I always say about storms and light? Maybe this is our storm, but the light will come. E. The sharp crack of breaking china startled him from his thoughts. He rushed to the kitchen to find Mrs. Chen cleaning up a broken teacup, her hands shaking slightly. "So sorry," she muttered. "Bad omen, breaking things in morning." But Ethan noticed something else. Her face had gone pale as she stared at her phone on the counter. "Mrs. Chen, what is it?" The elderly woman hesitated, then turned her phone toward him. It was a news article about a break-in at her restaurant the night before. Nothing had been taken, but her office had been ransacked, specifically the filing cabinet where she kept her personal papers. "They look for Sarah's things," she said quietly. "Not first time. 2 years ago, same thing happened. Night before Sarah disappeared." Before Ethan could respond, a small voice came from the doorway. "Someone's trying to hurt my mom again, aren't they?" Lily stood there in oversized borrowed pajamas, looking younger and more vulnerable than ever. Ethan crossed the room and knelt before her. "No one's going to hurt anyone," he promised, though his heart was racing. "We're going to figure this out." "You don't understand," Lily's voice trembled. "Mom said if anything happened to her, I had to wait, had to keep the book safe until someone was ready to see. But she also said if they ever found out I had it..." She trailed off, tears welling in her eyes. Mrs. Chen moved to comfort her, but suddenly froze, staring out the kitchen window. A black SUV was parked across the street, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. As they watched, it pulled away slowly. Ethan's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Back off while you still can. Some things should stay buried." His first instinct was to call the police, but Mrs. Chen grabbed his arm. "No! Police involved last time. Report filed, evidence logged, then evidence disappear. Sarah try police. That why she run." Lily had gone very still, her small face set in concentration. "Mom said there was one person we could trust, someone who knew everything but had to stay hidden to keep the proof safe." She looked up at Ethan. "She said when the time was right, Emily would show us the way." "Emily?" Ethan's voice cracked. "But Emily's..." "The light," Lily interrupted, suddenly animated. "Mom always said Emily left a light for us to follow." She ran back to the guest room, returning with her stack of handwritten cards. She spread them out on the kitchen table, arranging them in some pattern only she understood. Ethan and Mrs. Chen watched as her small fingers sorted through the messages, each one written in Sarah's careful handwriting. Finally, she held one up triumphantly. "This one, Mum said this was the most important one, but I had to wait for the right person to give it to. The card read, "The light of truth is kept where broken hearts heal and lost souls find peace." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened. The garden, Emily's memorial garden at Children's Hospital. She helped design it before. Ethan felt his knees go weak. The Children's Hospital garden, a project Emily had been passionate about, insisting on overseeing every detail herself. She'd spent countless hours there in the months before her death, claiming she was supervising the installation. But what if? His phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "You have 1 hour to announce you're stepping down from Walker Construction. After that, we can't guarantee anyone's safety." Lily looked up from her cards, her eyes filled with a wisdom beyond her years. "We have to go to the garden, don't we? That's where Mom wanted us to go all along." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind racing. The garden would be safe. Public place, security cameras, witnesses. But something else nagged at him. He pulled out the photograph of Emily and Sarah again, studying the background. They were standing in front of a construction site, but not just any site. "They're at the hospital," he breathed. This photo, it was taken at the Children's Hospital during the garden construction. He looked closer at the plans they were holding, realizing they weren't structural documents at all, but garden blueprints. Mrs. Chen was already gathering her things. "I drive. My car less noticeable than yours." She looked pointedly at the street where the black SUV had been parked. As they prepared to leave, Lily carefully packed up her cards and the book. But when she tried to lift her small backpack, Ethan stopped her. "Wait," he said, going to his office. He returned with a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "Emily gave me this the week before she died, said not to open it unless something happened to her. I never could bring myself to look." Lily took the envelope carefully, adding it to her backpack. As they headed for Mrs. Chen's car, Ethan's phone rang again. Margaret's number. He declined the call, but not before seeing her text. "You're making a huge mistake. Think about what you're destroying." They drove through Chicago's morning traffic, taking a circuitous route to avoid being followed. Lily sat in the back seat, unusually quiet, while Mrs. Chen hummed softly to herself, her eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. Ethan's mind was racing, putting pieces together. Emily's insistence on personally overseeing the garden project, the extra hours she spent there, the special attention she paid to every detail of the design. Had she known? Had she been preparing somehow? As they approached the hospital, Lily suddenly spoke up. "Mom said Emily was like an angel. She said angels sometimes leave signs for us to follow, but we have to be brave enough to follow them." Ethan felt tears stinging his eyes. It sounded exactly like something Emily would say. She'd always believed in signs and meanings, in the poetry of everyday moments. He'd lost that part of himself after her death, buried it under work and guilt and Margaret's practical influence. The Children's Hospital loomed before them, its modern glass facade reflecting the morning sun. The memorial garden was in the back, a peaceful oasis designed to provide comfort to families dealing with serious illnesses. As they parked, Ethan noticed another black SUV pulling into the lot behind them. They followed, Mrs. Chen stated grimly, but Lily was already opening her door. "It doesn't matter," she said with quiet certainty. "We're supposed to be here. Mom said when we found the light, nothing could stop it from shining." They hurried toward the garden entrance, aware of footsteps behind them. Ethan took Lily's hand, feeling her small fingers grip his tightly. Whatever they were about to find, they would face it together. The garden was empty this early in the morning. Winter had stripped the trees bare, but Emily's design was still beautiful, winding paths, hidden nooks, and at the center, a fountain with a simple inscription, "Let light guide you home." Lily walked directly to the fountain, her steps sure and purposeful. She traced the inscription with her fingers, then looked up at Ethan. "This is it. This is where we're supposed to be." Behind them, they could hear voices. Margaret's among them, growing closer. But Lily was focused on something else, a small panel near the fountain's base that looked just slightly different from the rest of the stonework. "Emily's light," she whispered, pressing against it. With a soft click, the panel popped open, revealing a small, waterproof container. Time seemed to stand still in Emily's garden as Lily's small hands reached for the waterproof container. The morning air was crisp and cold, their breaths visible in small clouds, but none of them felt the chill. Behind them, footsteps and voices grew closer, but Lily remained focused on her task, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled the container free. "Stop right there!" Margaret's voice cut through the quiet morning air. She wasn't alone. Two men in dark suits flanked her, their stances threatening despite their professional appearance. "Ethan, think about what you're doing. Think about everything we've built." But Ethan wasn't listening to Margaret anymore. His eyes were fixed on the container in Lily's hands, a simple metal box with a small engraving that made his heart stop. "For E when you're ready to see the light. Love always, M." Mrs. Chen had positioned herself between them and Margaret's group, her small frame somehow imposing despite her age. "You know stop truth anymore," she declared, her accent thickening with emotion. "Too many lies already. Too much pain." Lily looked up at Ethan, holding out the box. "She left it for you," she said softly. "Emily knew you'd find it someday." With trembling hands, Ethan took the box. It was heavier than he expected, solid and real in a way that made his throat tight with emotion. But before he could open it, one of the men with Margaret stepped forward. "Mr. Walker," his voice was professionally smooth, "the board has convened an emergency meeting. They're prepared to offer you a very generous retirement package in exchange for your immediate resignation and your silence about certain historical matters." Historical matters. Ethan's voice was quiet but sharp. "Is that what we're calling Emily's death now? Sarah's disappearance? The lives lost in Detroit?" The man's face remained impassive. "The past is complicated, Mr. Walker. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." "My mom is not a sleeping dog." Lily's voice rang out, clear and angry. "She tried to help people. She and Emily both did." Her small hands clutched her backpack protectively, where invisible memories and Emily's unopened letter were safely stored. Margaret took a step forward, her designer heels clicking on the garden path. "Ethan, please, we can still fix this. Think about the company, about our future. Whatever's in that box, whatever you think you know, it doesn't have to change everything." But something had shifted in Ethan's expression. Looking at Margaret now, he saw her clearly for the first time in years. "It already has changed everything," he said quietly, "because I'm finally asking the right questions. Like why you were so insistent on handling all of Emily's personal effects after the accident. Why you made sure I never saw Sarah's letters. Why you pushed so hard to get that Detroit investigation closed." Margaret's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "I was protecting you. You were a mess after Emily died. The company needed strong leadership, not more controversy. I did what had to be done." What had to be done? A new voice joined the conversation, causing everyone to turn. A woman stood at the garden entrance, her dark hair streaked with grey, her face lined with years of hiding, but her eyes bright and alert. Lily's backpack fell to the ground as she stared in shock. "Mom," her voice was barely a whisper. Sarah Matthews walked slowly into the garden, her eyes never leaving her daughter. "Yes, baby, I'm here." She looked older than in the photographs, tired in a way that spoke of years of running and hiding, but there was steel in her spine as she faced Margaret. "What had to be done?" Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "was to tell the truth about the Detroit project, about the safety violations, about what really happened the night Emily died." Margaret's face had gone pale. "You can't prove anything. All the evidence was destroyed." "Not all of it." Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out a small USB drive. "Emily was smart. She knew someone was intercepting her attempts to warn Ethan. That's why she made copies. That's why she built this garden, not just as a memorial, but as a safeguard. Ethan looked down at the box in his hands, then at Emily's letter in Lily's fallen backpack. All this time, she'd been trying to tell him something. Even after she was gone, she'd left him a path to follow. The men with Margaret shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to handle this new development. But Margaret herself had moved past uncertainty into desperation. "None of this matters," she snapped. "The statute of limitations on Detroit has expired. Any evidence you think you have is circumstantial at best. And who's going to believe you? A disgraced former employee who abandoned her own child? A grieving widower who can't let go of the past? A homeless little girl? They'll believe this." Ethan had finally opened the box. Inside was a letter, several thumb drives, and most damning of all, Margaret's own handwritten notes detailing how to intercept and destroy evidence of the safety violations. Notes that Emily had apparently discovered and preserved. "Emily knew," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She knew what you were doing, and she made sure the truth would come out eventually. That's what she was bringing me that night, wasn't it? Not just evidence of the violations, but evidence of the cover-up. Evidence of your involvement." Margaret's composure shattered completely. "Everything I did for the company. We were on the verge of bankruptcy after the recession. One more major scandal, and we would have lost everything. I couldn't let Emily's bleeding heart destroy everything we'd built. So you made sure I was distracted that night." Ethan's voice was deadly quiet. "All those urgent calls about the Beijing contract, the constant emergencies that kept me on the phone while I was driving. You made sure I wouldn't be able to focus on what Emily was trying to tell me." Sarah stepped forward, her arm around Lily, who had run to her embrace. Emily figured it out too late. She left all of this, the garden, the evidence, the messages, as a fail-safe. She knew someday someone would be ready to see the truth. One of the men with Margaret had pulled out his phone, stepping away to make a call. The other was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Even they could sense that the ground had shifted, that whatever power Margaret had held over this situation was crumbling. "It's over, Margaret," Ethan said quietly. "I'm not running from the truth anymore." Margaret looked around wildly, like a cornered animal. Her eyes fell on Lily's backpack, still lying on the ground where it had fallen. In a desperate move, she lunged for it. "No!" Sarah's cry rang out as she pushed Lily behind her protectively. But Margaret wasn't after them. She grabbed the backpack and pulled out Emily's unopened letter, holding it over the garden fountain. "One last piece of her." Margaret's voice was almost hysterical. "One last message you never got to read. Would be a shame if it got destroyed like all the others." But Lily's voice rang out clear and strong. "You can't destroy it," she said. "You can't destroy any of it anymore. The truth is like light. Once it starts shining, you can't make it dark again." As if in response to her words, the morning sun broke through the winter clouds, illuminating the garden in a way that made the fountain's water sparkle like diamonds. Margaret stood frozen, the letter held over the water as the reality of her situation finally seemed to sink in. The man who had stepped away to make a phone call returned, his face grave. "Ms. Reynolds, the board would like to speak with you. Immediately." Margaret's hand dropped, the letter falling harmlessly onto the garden path. All the fight seemed to drain out of her at once, leaving behind a shell of the powerful woman she'd pretended to be. Without another word, she turned and walked away, followed by her increasingly uncomfortable associates. In the sudden quiet of the garden, Ethan found himself facing Sarah and Lily. There was so much to say, so many questions to ask, so much time to make up for. But for now, he simply picked up Emily's fallen letter and held it out to them. "Would you—" His voice cracked slightly. "Would you help me read it?" Sarah and Lily drew closer, and together they finally opened Emily's last message. As they read, none of them noticed Mrs. Chen quietly making her way to the garden entrance, standing guard to ensure no one would interrupt this moment of truth and healing. The morning sun continued to rise over Chicago, its light touching everything in the garden. The bare winter trees, the quiet fountain, and 4 people whose lives had been torn apart by lies, but were finally being brought back together by truth. Emily's letter trembled in Ethan's hands as he unfolded it. Sarah and Lily pressed close on either side of him. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, but Emily's handwriting was as clear and beautiful as ever. Together, they began to read. "My dearest Ethan, if you're reading this, it means 2 things. I'm no longer with you, and you've finally found your way back to the light. I always knew you would, even if the path was long and dark. First, you need to know that none of this was your fault. The accident, the phone calls, the distractions, it was all orchestrated. Margaret made sure you wouldn't be able to focus on the road that night. She knew I was coming to show you everything we'd discovered about Detroit, about the safety violations, about her own involvement in covering it all up. But this letter isn't about blame or guilt. It's about hope and truth, and the light that can shine even in the darkest places. You see, Sarah and I discovered something far more important than corporate corruption. We discovered that one person's courage can inspire another's, that truth has a way of finding its path to the surface, and that love, real, honest, unselfish love, can survive anything, even death. Sarah was more than my colleague. She was my best friend, my partner in trying to make things right. When we realized how deep the corruption went, how many lives were at risk, we knew we had to act. But we also knew it might cost us everything. That's why I built this garden, Ethan. Not just as a place of healing for the children and families who need it, but as a sanctuary for the truth. Every detail, every path, every flower bed was designed with purpose. The truth had to be protected until the right time, until the right people were ready to see it. Sarah, if you're reading this too, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better. I'm sorry you had to run. But I've never been more proud to call someone my friend. Your courage, your integrity, your unwavering dedication to doing what's right, you've taught me so much. Take care of your beautiful daughter. She has your heart and your strength, and the world needs more of both. And Lily, sweet, brave Lily, I never got to meet you, but I've heard so much about you from your mom. Keep holding on to those special words, those messages of hope and light. They're more powerful than any lie, any darkness. You've been so brave, carrying this burden for so long. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Ethan, my love, this next part is especially for you. Do you remember what I always said about storms and light? The truth is, you were my light. Even when work consumed you, even when you lost your way sometimes, your heart remained good and true. That's why I knew you'd find your way back eventually. That's why I left all these breadcrumbs for you to follow. In the box, you'll find everything needed to make things right. Evidence of the safety violations, proof of the cover-up, documentation of every attempt to silence the truth. But more importantly, you'll find something else, a chance to rebuild, to heal, to create something better from the ashes of what was lost. The Detroit collapse didn't just kill innocent people. It shattered families, destroyed lives, broke trust that may never be fully repaired. But you have a chance now to make amends, to rebuild not just buildings, but faith in what's right and true. I've left instructions with my lawyers about compensating the Detroit victims' families. Use the evidence to make sure justice is served, but then focus on healing, on rebuilding, on creating something positive from all this pain. The garden was just the beginning. There's so much more good you can do. Sarah and Lily need you now, just as you need them. The 3 of you have been through so much darkness, carried so much pain, but together you can find your way back to the light. Together you can build something beautiful from all this brokenness. Remember what I always told you about family. It's not just about blood, it's about love, trust, and choosing to stand together even when the world feels like it's falling apart. You have a chance to be part of a new family now, one built on truth and healing rather than secrets and pain. The hardest part of leaving was knowing I wouldn't be there to see you find your way back, but I never lost faith that you would. You're stronger than you know, Ethan. You always have been. Take care of each other. Help Sarah and Lily heal from their years of running and hiding. Let them help you heal from your years of guilt and isolation. The light is strongest when we share it with others. And Ethan, it's okay to be happy again. It's okay to love again. It's what I've always wanted for you. All my love, always and forever, Emily. The garden was silent when they finished reading, save for the gentle splash of the fountain. Tears flowed freely down all their faces, but they were different kinds of tears now. Not just of grief and loss, but of release, of understanding, of hope. Lily was the first to speak, her small voice steady despite her tears. She knew. She knew we'd all find each other. Sarah pulled her daughter close, looking at Ethan with eyes full of years of unspoken words. Emily always did see things the rest of us missed. She saw the connections before they even existed. Ethan carefully folded the letter, his hands steadier now. The weight of guilt he'd carried for 8 years was lifting, replaced by something else. Purpose, clarity, the understanding of what needed to be done. Mrs. Chen approached quietly from her post at the garden entrance. "Time to go," she said softly. "Much work to do." She was right. There would be legal battles ahead. Corporate restructuring, compensation for the Detroit victims' families. The evidence Emily had preserved would ensure justice was served, but that was just the beginning. The next few months passed in a blur of activity. Margaret and her conspirators faced legal consequences for their roles in the cover-up. The truth about Detroit finally came to light, bringing both pain and long-delayed healing. Ethan used much of his personal fortune to establish a foundation for the victims' families, naming it after Emily. The Walker Plaza project was completely redesigned. Instead of a shopping center, it became the Emily Walker Community Center, providing services and support for homeless families. Sarah, with her years of experience in construction safety, was appointed to head the project. Lily thrived in her new life, but she never forgot her time on the streets. She started a program at the community center, teaching other homeless children to read and write, sharing her mother's special messages of hope and light with those who needed them most. 1 year later, they gathered in the garden again. The winter had given way to spring, and Emily's carefully planned flower beds were in full bloom. Ethan, Sarah, and Lily stood by the fountain, watching as a new plaque was unveiled. In memory of Emily Walker, who showed us that light can shine even in the darkest places, and that love can build bridges across any distance. May this garden continue to be a place of healing, truth, and hope for all who need it. Lily placed a fresh daisy by the plaque, the same kind she'd given Ethan that stormy day that felt like a lifetime ago. Sarah's hand found Ethan's, squeezing gently. They weren't just 3 broken people anymore, bound together by loss and secrets. They were a family, built on truth, strengthened by love, guided by the light Emily had left behind. That evening, as the sun set over Chicago, Lily sat in what was now her bedroom in Ethan's house. Their house. She carefully placed invisible memories on her bookshelf, next to Emily's letter and her mother's handwritten cards. She didn't need them as desperately anymore. Their messages were carved into her heart. Downstairs, she could hear Sarah and Ethan talking softly in the kitchen, the sounds of dinner being prepared, of life going on. Mrs. Chen would be arriving soon. She never missed their weekly family dinners. Lily walked to her window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, other people were facing their own storms, searching for their own light. She hoped they would find it, just as she had. "The storm only brings light to those ready to see it," she whispered to herself, Emily's words now carrying new meaning. She understood now that sometimes the storm itself was necessary, that only by facing the darkness could you truly appreciate the light. As if in response to her thoughts, the last rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and rose. Lily smiled, feeling Emily's presence in that moment of beauty. The light had been there all along, waiting for them to be ready to see it, and now that they could see it, now that they had found each other, it would never truly be dark again.